Okay, so we are going to begin with money and banking. This is also a very fruitful topic in the GCE, both in the ordinary levels and the advanced level. So it's very important. So we're going to treat, first of all, we're going to talk on money, and from money now we move to banking. Okay, now in the primitive days, remember in those days, money was not being used for transaction. So a form of trade was being used known as a trade by barter. Trade by barter. That is, before money was being introduced, this form of trade was being used to carry out exchange. Trade by barter. The question now is, what is trade by barter? This is the exchange of goods and services, the exchange of goods and services for goods and services without the use of money, the use of money. For example, I can have a bunch of plantain, and I need a bag of salt. I meet somebody that has now a bag of salt, and we do the exchange. I give him or her my bunch of plantain, and in return he gives me what? A bag of salt, without the use of money. But there is a problem here. This trade by barter concept has some limitations. It has some limitations. In some books, you will see they call it drawbacks. In some books, you will see they call it disadvantages. Disadvantages of trade by barter. So we need to see some of the disadvantages or the limitations of trade by barter. The first that we are going to see, which is the most important, is the problem of what? Double coincidence of ones. Double coincidence of ones. Now, this is the most important limitation of trade by barter. Now, how does it act as a limitation or a drawback or a disadvantage? It was difficult to see somebody with what you want, and in return that person need what you have. For example, based on our example that I mentioned here, that I have a bunch of plantain and I exchange it for what? A bag of salt. But the problem here is that this person having a bag of salt must need what? A bunch of plantain. He can have a bag of salt but does not need a bunch of plantain, so we cannot carry out trade. So this is the most important, and it was time consuming and waste of energy. It was time consuming and also waste of energy. Why? Because you have to start moving from one place to another to see somebody with what you want, and in return that person to need what you have. The second is lack of common measures of value. Lack of common measure of value. Now, with this, it was difficult to know the quantity of a commodity one could exchange for one another. Here, to know the quantity of goods that is to be exchanged for one another was very difficult. So it was difficult, for example, to do what? To know a quantity of dry fish, for example, to be exchanged for what? For salt. So it was very difficult. I have salt, you have dry fish. Let us assume that we need these two goods. So it will be very difficult for me to know the quantity of salt that I'm going to exchange for what? For dry fish, which is a very big problem with trade. The third limitation that we're going to see was existence of large and indivisible items. In some books you see problems of divisibility. So there are some items or some goods that are very large and cannot be divided into smaller units. Remember, we need large scale transaction and small scale transaction. But there are some goods that are very large that cannot be divided into smaller units. For example, a cow. I can have a cow and I need a bag of salt. It is very difficult for these two individuals to carry out trade. I have a cow, you have what? A bag of salt. I cannot exchange my cow for salt. And also, it will be very difficult for me to cut a part of that cow and exchange it for salt, and the cow still be alive for trade to be carried out. So the problem of large and indivisible item was very difficult to divide some goods into smaller units. So this makes trade very difficult. Also, the fourth type of the fourth limitation is about the problem of deferred payment. The problem of deferred payment. What does this mean? It means that credit transactions are impossible, as it was difficult to take goods and services on credit. Lending was also impossible, and this reduced what? The volume of trade. Nowadays with the use of money, you can consume goods now and payment being done in the future. But in those days, the problem of trade by barter, it was very difficult for you to consume goods now and payment being done in the future. Also, the next problem that we are going to see will be 5. The next problem we're going to see will be the problem of saving. Problem of saving or storage. Okay, now you see that people find it very difficult to accumulate wealth. That's why in those days poverty was rampant, because people find it very difficult to accumulate wealth in terms of what? Goods and services. Why? Because some goods were perishable. And they cannot be kept for a longer period of time. They cannot be kept for a long period of time. And the storage facility at that particular moment in time was very poor. So by so doing, you see that it increased what? Poverty, as people find it very difficult to accumulate wealth. Okay, the next that we're going to talk about is the problem of portability. 6. As a 6, problem of portability. Why? Because during the barter system of trade, it was not possible to carry goods from one place to another because of what? Their bulkiness. They were very bulky. Bulky goods, bulkiness, and this made exchange very difficult, especially when goods to be traded are what? Are bulky or landed items. So these are some of the limitations of trade by barter.